I think we're ready now to start. So let me introduce and welcome for our next SPUR presentation, Raihan Alam, who's going to talk about probing the relationship between anti-racism and pro-environmental attitudes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kress. So hello, everyone. My name is Raihan Alam. I'm a senior at Lehigh University. I'm double majoring in psychology and political science. I'm going to talk a bit today about work I've been doing with my faculty advisor, Dr. Tiffany Brandon, and her lab manager, Rachel Smith at UCLA. So let's get into probing the relationship between anti-racism and pro-environmental attitudes. So in the summer of 2020, our country had a national reckoning with racism after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officers. The George Floyd protests were one of the largest, if not the largest, protests in American history. According to polls, it's estimated that about 15 to 26 million people participated in the protests. This is significant. It's like 5 to 10% of the American population, that too during the height of the pandemic. Now, this is crucial because collective action movements often have a transformative impact on socio-political attitudes. For example, researchers have analyzed Google Books, Google News, and the news media to show that the summer 2020 protests were associated with an increase in interest in Black Lives Matter and anti-racist theory. Specifically, there was an uptick in discussion in terms such as white supremacy, mass incarceration, and systemic racism. And moreover, they found that interest in these terms sustained into December 2020, well beyond the height of the protests. And work from actually one of my advisors here at Lehigh, political scientist Dr. Anthony DiMaggio, has shown that support for Black Lives Matter was a predictor of belief that racial discrimination is a serious problem in the United States, greater than political ideology. So at the same time, Americans are not happy with what the federal government has been doing or not been doing about climate change. So for example, 2/3 of Americans think that the government is not doing enough to reduce the effects of global climate change and associated environmental problems like environmental quality protection. In fact, in the 2020 election, 2/3 of voters told exit pollsters that climate change was a serious problem. With our current climate adaptation politics, we're still headed for a 3°C increase in the climate, which will lead to fiercer storms, higher sea levels, extinctions, heat deaths, and a host of negative problems. Now, these two issues, racial justice and climate action, are related. Climate change is an intersectional problem. So African American and low-income communities are disproportionately affected by air pollution in the United States. For example, over 1 million African Americans live within a half-mile radius of natural gas facilities. And they face a cancer risk above the EPA's level of concern due to unclean air. And as oceans absorb CO2 released in the atmosphere, the seafood diet and economy of coastal Native American tribes are also disproportionately affected by climate change. Racial disparities also exist in post-disaster relief. White counties see increases in average wealth after the natural disasters, while predominantly minority communities see wealth decreases, as white communities receive higher levels of reinvestment in the communities during times of disaster compared to their minority community counterparts. And lastly, low-income minorities are more likely to suffer from the consequence of climate change-related events like tropical storms due to inadequate infrastructure and lack of proper insurance. So given this intersectional connection between racial justice and climate action, we hypothesize that anti-racism efforts may be linked to pro-environmental attitudes. Now, prior work from Dr. Brandon and her graduate student, Riley Marshall, support this hypothesis, but in a different domain, pandemic mitigation efforts. They showed that BLM support is intersectional as it was associated with lower levels of vaccine hesitancy. They also found that this relationship was partially mediated by pro-social intergroup attitudes, so greater levels of concerns and perspective taking towards minority groups. So for our study, we tested the predicted link between anti-racism support measured at time 1 and pro-environmental attitudes measured at time 2 in about 1,800 racial and ethnic minorities and 5,000 white respondents. We used data from the American National Election Study, which measured BLM support and pro-environmental attitudes before and after the 2020 election. We also test these relationships using the Yale Climate Survey and General Social Survey, which replicate our effect from the American National Election Study, but I'll be focusing on the American National Election Study data. And we split these data in white and minority because there are a variety of reasons why they might have different attitudes, given particularly what I've been talking about, the disproportionate impact of climate change and racism on these groups. So for our main predictor variable, we measured anti-racism by asking people the extent to which they thought it was better to deal with social unrest by correcting issues of racism and police violence versus a strict law and order approach. For the outcome variable program with attitudes, we made a composite. We asked people how much they supported more government regulation of carbon emissions and the extent to which they thought that severe weather events were linked to climate change. And for our last outcome variable, importance of climate change to self, we sort of asked the face value question, how important is the issue of climate change to you personally? And then we had a number of control variables, such as program attitudes at time 1, measured using the same question, political affiliation, so Democrat, Republican, or independent, educational attainment, race as Black, Asian, or Latino, if they lived in an urban or rural setting, how old they were, and their gender. So here's a quick table for descriptive statistics. So one thing to note is that program with attitudes and anti-racism support seem to be on average a bit higher in our minority respondents with smaller standard deviations compared to white respondents. And all right, let's get to our main results. So here's a regression table predicting program with attitudes at time 2 in minority respondents. And I show some of our main control variables. Again, this is a truncated list as we have a number of other covariates, as I mentioned in the previous slide, such as Republican independent affiliation. So as you can see, anti-racism support at time 1 seems to be a significant predictor of program of attitudes at time 2, even controlling for time 1 program of attitudes, democratic political affiliation, and educational attainment. It also seems to be a bit of a stronger predictor than educational attainment. So here's a regression table with the same model, but this time for white respondents. We find the same thing. Anti-racism support is a significant predictor, controlling for time 1 program of attitudes, democratic political affiliation, and educational attainment, also in our white respondents. Now, this regression table is predicting the importance of climate change to self at time 2 in minority respondents. As you can see, anti-racism support at time 1 is a significant predictor again, controlling for these main variables. Is again a strong predictor than educational attainment, but also a significant predictor unlike democratic political affiliation. And then we find, again, a similar pattern in our white respondents. Anti-racism is a significant predictor of importance of climate change itself, controlling for these factors, stronger than educational attainment, but this time democratic political affiliation is significant. So to conclude, anti-racism support is a predictor of program of attitudes, importance of climate change to self for both white and minority respondents. This is true even controlling for a host of factors, particularly democratic political affiliation, race, and educational attainment. For both white and minority respondents, it is consistently a stronger predictor of program of attitudes and educational attainment. This also shows that support for environmental attitudes can't simply be chalked up to political affiliation, but anti-racism has an independent relationship to pro-environmental attitudes. And for our racial and ethnic minority respondents, it is a significant predictor of importance of climate change itself, while political party affiliation was only marginally significant. We think that future work should examine what mediates this relationship. Is it pro-social intergroup attitudes like it was for the vaccine hesitancy paper, or is something else going on? So yeah, thank you all very much. I just want to thank Dr. Brannon for having me on this project. Before, my research experience was primarily in experiments, so it's really helpful getting this big data approach to answering questions I just did not have any familiarity with. I also want to thank Professor Krause for having these workshops and teaching me a lot of skills in presentation, giving me the opportunity to learn how to code in R, and just all these useful panels that have been really helpful in my graduate application. So I'm really grateful to be part of the SPUR program. So thank you all very much. Let me know if you have any questions or ideas or anything.